Hi, everybody. I'm Jenny Gage, and this is Life Take 2, where I share my harrowing escape from Mormon tradwife life. That has been the catchphrase I've been going with here on my channel for a while, and I love it because it sounds melodramatic and also perfectly encapsulates what my life and my channel are all about. Today, I wanted to share a little bit of the reality behind my escape from Mormon tradwife life and what it truly means for me to be a cycle breaker in my family. Today, I'd like to share with you some of the women in my family history so I can shine a light on the cycle that I inherited. This is Katie Mae Campbell. She is my paternal grandmother, born in 1903, somewhere in the Ozarks. I remember her telling me stories when I was a little girl of growing up with 12 or 13 brothers and sisters, of Scottish and German ancestry, first or second generation immigrants, and living in a tiny one-room house with brothers and sisters on little bedrolls on the floor, with one giant bed in the middle that my great-grandmother and great-grandfather slept in. Katie grew up in extreme poverty with parents who mostly lived off the land and occasionally worked as sharecroppers and doing odd jobs. By the time she was 14 years old, she decided to make her way in the world. My grandma Katie was drop dead gorgeous, had an incredible intellect, and this bright, big, shining personality that drew people to her even later in life when she was in a nursing home. I'm pretty sure that 99.999% of any charisma and spark that I have comes from her. So leaving home at 14, she put that intellect and charisma to work and waited tables and lived in tiny apartments above restaurants, scraped and saved, and made a pretty decent life for herself. I never appreciated as a child when she was telling me these stories how difficult that must have been until I became the mom of 14-year-old girls. And I can't imagine any of my daughters overcoming the obstacles that Katie was faced with. One night in the middle of World War II, Katie and a friend would go to a dance hall where Katie would meet and be swept off her feet, quite literally, by a man named Stanley Gage. Katie would tell me that she knew in that moment that she had found her happily ever after. They went across the river that night where there were same-day marriage licenses and got married. Within 10 months, my dad would be born. Within 4 years, Katie's happily ever after would come crashing to the ground as she had to flee domestic violence, leaving my dad as a 4-year-old without his father in his life. He would never see him again. My grandfather, Stanley, whose name I took when I divorced, died not too many decades later of cirrhosis of the liver and spent a lot of his life in and out of veterans hospitals with severe PTSD and alcoholism. After 4 years of what she hoped would be a fairy tale that ended up being abusive and dark, Katie would find herself all alone in the world, trying to make a life for her and her son. Decades later, that son would meet and fall in love with a spicy Scottsdale redhead while he was at BYU. My mom thought that she had found her happily ever after, the life of her dreams. She would have me 10 months after her wedding at the ripe old age of 21. And because Heavenly Father was her birth control, according to the doctrines of the Mormon Church, she would have baby after baby, 5 in total. And while my dad never abandoned her, he was very loyal. He was never able to provide the financial support for a family of 5 kids and a wife. So, as a very young mother to 5 kids under the age of 10, my mom found herself trying to make a life for herself and her children. I remember as a child going with my mom to the grocery store and her ripping paper food stamps out of a booklet or waiting in line for government American cheese, powdered milk, bread, things like that. And I remember at Christmas time, which we're approaching right now, my mom buying paint and paintbrushes and then going around to local businesses and asking if she could paint their windows so that she could just raise a little bit of money to give us a very modest Christmas and a little bit of a Christmas dinner. I also remember during much of my childhood opening the door to boxes full of turkeys, canned cranberries, usually a pumpkin pie and some Cool Whip tucked into that box. As neighbors and our church and local charities tried to supplement the income that my young mom, who didn't have her own education, who didn't have any way to provide for our family, did the best that she could. I left home at age 17 to go to college and was bright and capable and hoped that I had a big, beautiful future ahead of me. At age 19, I would meet a Mormon returned missionary and see that happily ever after in his eyes. We would marry 6 weeks later. Within just weeks of our temple wedding, I would begin to suffer sometimes terrifying abuse for so many reasons, including the fact that I didn't really have anywhere to go if I divorced him. My childhood home was a nightmare. My parents were living in poverty, and the Mormon church doesn't really have a provision for divorce. We were sealed for time and all eternity, and there was no canceling that and other complicating factors. I stayed with him for 24 years. Then one day, at age 44, he would abandon our family, and I would find myself without a degree, without a career, just struggling to make ends meet for myself and my children on the other end of what was supposed to be a happily ever after story. In my entire family, for as many generations as we can remember, the women in my family line have either been married, had babies, or both by the time they were 21 years old. And in that family line, there are only a few exceptions to the rule of women finding themselves in terrible toxic relationships. They can't escape. And if they do escape, finding themselves in poverty. Unfortunately, I had found myself in that exact same trap because domestic violence and the circumstances that lead to it tend to be inherited, whether that's childhood poverty, mirroring the behaviors that we see in our own families, just lacking the resources to know or do any better. It tends to go from generation to generation. But one day in the middle of my divorce, I thought about all of this and I looked at all the women in my life who had terrible lives, even the ones who had had kind of good lives in this system of young marriage, stay-at-home moms, no financial resources, lots of children. And I decided to do something about it. I decided that my young daughter, still at home, was going to be the very last, that this cycle was going to break with me. I would be the last link in this chain that passed this horrible heritage down to my daughter. I have done everything I can for the past 6 years to make sure she has the resources to get an education, transportation to school, that she can live at home and has access to everything she needs to break this cycle. This right here is my youngest daughter. She is going to turn 22 this year. She found a program where she could get her culinary arts degree for almost free 2 years ago. She's now working on a business degree, has a full-time job, was able to buy a car, is thinking of living out this summer if she has the resources to make sure she can provide for herself all on her own without having to have any help from mom or dad or a boyfriend or anything. And she is the very first woman in my family in as many generations as anybody can remember who will turn 22 without being married or having babies. And I have to be honest, there are days that I feel like I'm inventing the wheel or figuring out how to make fire when I've never seen it done before, because I was raised to get married and be a trad wife. Even things like financial planning, credit, and figuring out what to do for future employment. I haven't figured that out for myself. It's very difficult to teach this daughter how to be everything that I was not. But I'm giving it all I've got. And while I can't go back and give the women in my life a chance to live that happily ever after that they never got, I'm doing all I can to change the world for my daughter and for all of our daughters.